On the night of January 29th, 2008, in Raleigh, North Carolina, a 21-year-old lady, Latrice Curtis, was cheating on her husband, Darin Curtis, with another man known as Steven Randolph. At that time, Steven Randolph was living with a 43-year-old gay pastor known as Robert Reaves. Pastor Robert had been convicted several times before after being caught having sex with young boys at his church. Pastor Robert was obsessed with having sex with Stephen, but unfortunately, Stephen had been rejecting his sexual advances. So, on the night of January 29th, 2008, Latrice was having sex with Stephen, and Pastor Robert saw it. He was filled with so much rage that Latrice was taking his man, so he murdered her by stabbing her 40 times. Even though Latrice was cheating on her husband, she never deserved to die such a cruel death at the hands of a gay pastor. This is the story of Latrase Curtis. Latrice Maitrell Jones was born May 28, 1986, in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was the last born in a family of 4 children. She had 3 brothers who were known as Justin, Marlon, and Jason. Latrice's father was known as Sherman Jones, a retired juvenile corrections officer, while her mother was Cynthia Wheels Jones. Being the only daughter in the family, her father loved her very much, and she received a special attention compared to her brothers. She was her daddy's little girl. She followed him everywhere. They would go fishing and hunting together. Her father even taught her how to play basketball, which was his favorite sports. After completing her high school education, Latrice was enrolled at Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, in the year 2004. While at the college, she majored in accounting. It was while there that she met a man named Darin Curtis. Darin was born in the year 1981 in Raleigh, and he worked as a National Guard soldier before he left to join Bennett College. While at the college, Darin was also studying accounting, so the two were colleagues. The two became friends, and later on, they started dating each other secretly. In the year 2005, Latrice transferred to Wake Technical Community College in Greensboro, North Carolina, where she continued with her studies. Darin and Latrice secretly dated each other for a year. Later on, Darin went on his knee and proposed to Latrice. Latrice happily accepted the marriage proposal and so on. April 27th, 2007, the couple got married at the courtroom in Wake County. After their wedding, the couple moved into their first apartment on River Shadow Court, where they settled. Latrice then transferred to North Carolina Central University in Durham to complete her accounting degree. She also worked part-time in the Human Resource Department in a company known as Sears. The company was located in Triangle Town Center Mall. Her husband Darin also worked part-time as an accountant in a firm which was in Raleigh as he continued with his studies. Later on, Latrice reported to her work as usual, but her colleagues were greatly surprised when they saw a wedding ring on her finger. It was then that Latrice told them that she is married to Darin Curtis. Her colleagues could not believe this. Her best friend Kimberly Parker was so shocked that she hid her marriage from her. Later on, Latrice invited her parents and siblings to meet her husband, Darin Curtis. When Latrice's parents learned that their daughter was married without their knowledge, they were extremely mad and deeply hurt. They couldn't understand why the two could do something like that to them. Sherman, who held traditional values, believed that if a man wants to propose to a woman, he had to ask for her father's blessings first. Sherman felt deeply disrespected by Darin. Latrice tried to reassure her family that she still trusts them and loved them deeply, and that hiding her marriage from them wasn't a sign of a bad thing. She told her family that her relationship with her husband, Darin, was really strong, happy, and good. However, after that disastrous meeting, Sherman was too upset, and he kept a really big distance between his daughter, Latrice, and her husband, Darin Curtis. The two of them spent most of their time studying. They spent less of their time together, and this affected the bond between them. Soon the couple started having a lot of problems in their marriage. 9 months into their marriage, Latrice, who was in her senior year at the university, began cheating on her husband with a man named Steven Randolph. Stephen was also a student at North Carolina Central University, the same university Latrice was studying at. He was a womanizer who liked having sex with multiple women, so the two met at the campus. Stephen, who was also in his senior year at the university, was playing basketball and had dreams of one day joining the NBA and making the basketball sports to be his professional career. Stephen worked part-time at a local car wash so that he can earn a living. Unfortunately, the job was not steady, so he was not earning enough money. The situation made him homeless, so getting a place to sleep was a big problem. He would visit his friends, who offered him their couches to sleep on. At times, Stephen would sleep inside his car. In the summer of 2007, a man named Robert Reaves arrived at the car wash to have his car cleaned. Robert was born in Durham, North Carolina. He worked as a pastor administering the Word of God to the people at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in South Carolina. He was known as Bishop, but unfortunately, Pastor Robert was gay. He would have sex with young boys of his church. Therefore, on September 3rd, 1987, he was convicted of third-degree sex charges, assault and battery. After being released from prison, he moved to New York and opened a church. He then began having sex with young boys again, but he would escape to another city to avoid being caught. Later on, he joined Cedar International Fellowship, where he became a pastor, but unfortunately, he continued making sexual advances to men and young boys. Pastor Robert lived with his sister Willie Mae Thorpe in a 2-bedroom house. His sister lived in the room upstairs while he lived in a basement suite. So when Pastor Robert and Stephen met at a car wash, he immediately became interested in having sex with him, so he befriended him. The two later on met multiple times at South Point Mall. During one of those meetings, Stephen confided in Pastor Robert that he was homeless, and he also needed to find a good job. Pastor Robert offered Stephen a place to live in. That was in his own basement apartment. He told Stephen that he only needed him to pay him a monthly rent fee of $300 since they would be sharing the room, so Stephen agreed and moved in with him. Later on, while the two were staying together, Pastor Robert started engaging in a strange sexual conversation with Stephen. He asked him about the size of his penis. He also asked him if he has ever had an oral sex done to him by a man. Pastor Robert again went ahead and asked Stephen if he has ever considered being a male escort. Before Stephen knew it, Pastor Robert asked him to do an oral sex with him, and in return, he would not charge him the house rent. Stephen rejected Pastor Robert's sexual advances. This made Pastor Robert to quickly apologize. As much as Stephen wanted to move out of Pastor Robert's house, he couldn't do it because he had no place to go. Stephen felt very insecure, so he borrowed a gun from his cousin D'Angelo for protection, just in case the man of God tried to do something stupid. Stephen began sleeping with the gun underneath his pillow every night. Later on, October 2007, John Ross, who worked as a home alarm installation system technician, went to the house of Pastor Robert at 8 o'clock in the morning to install the alarm system. When he arrived, he found Pastor Robert, who wore a nice suit, and Stephen in the house. However, 15 minutes later, Stephen left the house, leaving Pastor Robert and John all alone in the room. Pastor Robert went and changed into a sleeveless undershirt and a pair of shorts. He then came to the room where John was working and started talking to him about sex. Pastor Robert told John that he really had nice features. He told him that he should consider working as a male escort. Unexpectedly, Pastor Robert asked John, "How big is the size of his penis?" John felt very uncomfortable, but before he knew it, Pastor Robert grabbed him by his wrist and pulled him towards the bathroom. He told him to close his eyes and let him have sex with him. He promised to pay him for it. However, John pulled out of Pastor Robert's grip and ran out of the house, leaving his tools behind. Later on, Stephen brought his other girlfriend, a lady known as Velma Newton, into the house, and they had sex. Pastor Robert was very jealous when he saw Stephen having sex with Velma, but Stephen continuously refused to have sex with him. Pastor Robert was filled with rage and jealousy, so he slashed their car tires without their knowledge. Unfortunately, at that time, Stephen was short of money, so he was not in a position to repair his car. He went to Pastor Robert and asked him for permission to use his van because his car tires had been slashed. Pastor Robert gave him the keys to the van, and he permitted him to use it whenever he wants. After using the van for some time, Stephen went to the gas station and fixed his car tires. Because of jealousy and obsession, Pastor Robert began making strange phone calls to Stephen and his girlfriend Velma. Unfortunately, they didn't know it was him because he was using a private number. He called Velma and told her that he would break both of Stephen's legs so that he wouldn't play basketball anymore. He then told her that the only way to save her boyfriend Stephen was if she told him to stop what he is doing. That was having a relationship and engaging in sex with her. Pastor Robert also made the strange phone call to Stephen and told him that he better have a gun. Truly, Stephen was shaken up by the call. Later on, when Stephen went to check on his gun under the pillow, he didn't find it, so he confronted Pastor Robert. Fortunately, the pastor admitted that he took the gun. During Christmas break of 2007, Stephen went out of town to visit his family in Baltimore. While he was gone, Velma got yet another disturbing phone call. The unknown caller, who was Pastor Robert, told her that he had slashed all 4 of her tires and that he was sorry. When Velma went outside to check on her car, sure enough, her tires were slashed. After the Christmas break, Stephen returned and he continued living with Pastor Robert. Later on, Stephen brought her other girlfriend, Latrase Curtis, whom he knew was married, and the two spent time together. Pastor Robert again saw them, and his obsession and jealousy increased. On the night of January 29, 2008, Latrice got off from her class and she went to Stephen's place for the second time. She arrived there at 8 p.m., and the two spent a nice time together. They were having sex, and in the process, the condom which Stephen was wearing came off and got stuck inside Latrice's vagina. They tried to get it out, but it couldn't come out, so Latrice told him that she would remove the condom in the privacy of her own bathroom. Latrice then put her clothes on, and Stephen walked her to the driveway where her car was. He said goodbye to her, and Pastor Robert, who was around, had seen them having sex, and his jealousy and obsession were now beyond control. Latrice got into her car, and she started driving back home at around 10 p.m. Stephen also left the house, and he started heading to the house of his other girlfriend, Velma Newton. Pastor Robert also quickly entered into his minivan and started following Latrase Curtis behind. Meanwhile, as Stephen was driving to Velma's house, he called his friend, Warren Robertson, and he told her that a condom he was wearing during sex had stuck inside her girlfriend, Latrice Curtis' vagina. He told Warren that he was really worried that Latrice might get pregnant. Warren calmed him down, and Stephen suggested that they should meet at Velma's house so that they can talk about it. Warren agreed, and she began heading there. Stephen arrived at Velma's house. A few minutes later, Warren also arrived, and they began their conversations. While Latrice was driving home, she was worried that she might get pregnant, so she called Stephen, but because Stephen was at his other girlfriend's house, he excused himself and went to the bathroom where he answered the call. Latrice talked to him about taking their relationship to the next level. She confessed to him how deeply she loved him. However, Stephen told her that they would talk about it during their next meeting. Latrice agreed and hanged up her phone. She then continued driving back home. As Latrice was driving home, she picked her phone and called her husband, Darin. She told him that she was at the library and would pick up something to eat before heading home. Darin was very tired and exhausted after having a long day at work and studying. So he went to the bathroom, took a shower, had his dinner, and by 11 p.m. he was up waiting for his wife, Latrice, to come home. Unfortunately, his body was too tired, and soon he fell asleep. As Latrice was driving, she reached at Interstate 540. She noticed that someone was following her from behind, so she immediately got tensed up. The minivan immediately came around to her side, and she saw that it was Pastor Robert. Latrice was finally at ease, since she knew Pastor Robert, so she pulled over to speak to him. Pastor Robert got out of his minivan with a knife, and he entered into her car. He immediately began stabbing her. Latrice tried to run from him, but he was there every step of the way, stabbing until she fell. He turned her onto her back. Latrice tried to fight him off, and she managed to make 2 phone calls to Stephen and Kimberly Parker, but she never had a chance to say anything or ask them for help. Instead, Robert got his hands on her phone, turned it off, and tossed the phone out of the car window. Pastor Robert continued his onslaught, 40 stabs nearly severing her head, until Latrase Curtis was dead. He then drove her car a few miles ahead. He then dragged her from the car to the embankment, causing bilateral abrasions on her back and leaving bloodstains on the cement. Pastor Robert struggled to drag Latrase Curtis by her feet up the slope of the embankment. He then dumped her near Lewisburg Road and drove away. Meanwhile, Stephen stayed at Velma's house until 1 a.m. He then started his journey back home. When Stephen got home that night at 1:30 a.m., Stephen entered his personal code for the alarm. He didn't find Pastor Robert at home. He also noticed that his van was not at home, so he went to bed. Later on at 2:30 a.m., Pastor Robert arrived at home. He then entered the master code to deactivate the alarm system. He then cleared the remaining evidences that could implicate him in the murder of Latrice before going to bed. On the cold winter morning of January 30th, 2008, at around 7 a.m. in Raleigh, North Carolina, a man named David Jones was on his way to work. He was driving down the Interstate 540 highway in Wake County. He had just passed the Buffalo Road exit. Traffic was slowing down, and when he looked out through the car window on the side of the road, he saw somebody lying on the embankment. So he pulled over close to it and backed up to get a better look. He saw the body of a young woman. She was on her back with both arms spread out above her head and her legs spread very far apart. She was wearing blue jeans, a white long-sleeve top covered in blood. David called 911 to report the incident. Soon police officers arrived at the scene. They discovered that the victim had multiple stab wounds and 2 broken nails, indicating she had fought back. They discovered a footprint and a tire track. They also found blood on the cement of the highway. That same morning, Darin had woken up at 6:30 a.m. and discovered that his wife didn't come home last night, so he called her, but the call was not going through. After getting no response, he assumed that Latrice might have stopped at her parents' place, so he called her father, but her father didn't respond well to him, since they were not in good terms. Darin also called her friends, but no one had seen her. He then left for work at around 7:30 a.m. While heading to work, he drove by a group of police officers, standing by the side of the Interstate 540 surrounding a crime scene. There was a body covered with a blue tarp, and the scene was surrounded by a yellow tape. So he drove on, but just a short distance from the crime scene, Darin saw a white Nissan Sentra car that looked a lot like his wife's car. He pulled over and went to the driver's side of the car. He opens the door and looks inside. He notices there's a broken console. There's blood on the door. He also spots a picture of Latrice from Christmas that's lying on the back seat. His heart sank. Darin was so worried, and so he called 911 and reported that his wife, Latrice, was missing. Meanwhile, as the police continued investigating the crime scene, they found the victim's cell phone several hundred feet away from her body. The phone was turned off and had been exposed to rain. Half a mile from where the victim's body lay, the police saw 2 cars, a white Honda Civic and a white Nissan Sentra, parked on the side of the road. They saw a man standing by the Nissan, peering inside with the door wide open. The police started heading to where the man was. When Darin saw the officers heading his way, he quickly got out and started heading towards them. He identified himself as Darin Curtis, and he showed them a picture of his wife, Latrice Curtis. He also told them that the car was his wife's car. The officers were very surprised to see a man claiming to be the husband of the victim at the crime scene. First, the police searched the victim's car. There was blood inside the car, and the console was broken. They took DNA samples from several places inside the vehicle. When they ran the license plate of the vehicle, they discovered that it belonged to Latrase Curtis. After searching the car, they took him to identify the body. Darin followed the police officers, and after they arrived at the place where the body was, they raised the tarp for him so that he could see the body. Darin identified the body to be of his wife, Latrase Curtis. He stood frozen in front of his wife's body. He was so sad upon seeing the corpse of his wife. After identifying the body, he never informed anyone about the death of his wife, Latrice Curtis, not even her parents. The police brought Darin for an interrogation so that he can explain the accounts of the events that led him to the crime scene that morning. He told the police that his wife, Latrice, called him that night and informed him that she had gone to get something to eat after coming from school, and so she would arrive home late. He added that he waited for her, but he ended up falling asleep. When he woke up in the morning, he realized that Latrice never came home. The police took his DNA sample. They also made him take a lie detector. The police then ran his DNA against the DNA samples collected at Latrice's car, but there was no match, so they freed him for the time being. That morning, Latrice's father, Sherman, was watching news on the television. He saw a headline about how a body had been found at the side of the highway. At that time, the news reporter had not revealed the name of the victim yet. Sherman had a feeling that something was not right, so he called his daughter, Latrice, to make sure that she was all right, but unfortunately the call went to voicemail. He then called Darin. Unfortunately, the call also went to voicemail. Sherman then called at Latrase School. When the university department picked his call, they told him to speak to the police department. At that point, Sherman's heart sunk as he wondered what was happening. So he and his wife headed to the police station. Upon reaching at the police station, the detective sat them down and informed them that their daughter, Latrice Curtis, had been murdered. The body of Latrice was taken for an autopsy. Later on, the autopsy report was out, and the examiner discovered that Latrice had 40 stab wounds. She had been stabbed on her neck, chest, face, abdomen, and torso. Her throat was slit, her carotid artery was slashed open, her jugular vein was also slashed open, and her vocal cords were cut. Latrice also had a blunt force trauma to the back of her head. The medical examiner also found a condom inside of her vagina. And so the examiner told the police that Latrice had had sex recently. So the police immediately informed her husband, Darin, that a condom had been found inside his wife's vagina. And so they asked him if the condom belonged to him. Darin was so shocked after hearing that. He told the police that he and his wife have never used a protection during sex, so the condom wasn't his. The police then took his DNA sample and matched it with the DNA found in the condom. Unfortunately, there was no match, so the police believed that the condom wasn't his. The police continued with their investigations into the murder of Latrase Curtis. They needed to find out who Latrice slept with before her brutal murder. So they analyzed her cell phone records. As they were looking into her cell phone records, they discovered that Latrice had called her husband, Darin, on the night before. That was around the same time that Darin said Latrice called him. So they confirmed that Darin was actually telling the truth. The police also discovered that there were several calls between Latrice and a particular number around the time they believed Latrice was still alive. They investigated that number, and they found out that it belonged to Steven Randolph. The police needed to know the connection between Steven Randolph and Latrase Curtis, so they immediately began looking for him. Steven learned that the police were looking for him, so on February 1st, 2008, he walked into the police station to speak to the detectives. He was accompanied by Pastor Robert Reaves, who was his roommate. While at the police station, the police immediately separated Steven and Robert, and they proceeded to interrogate both of them separately. During the interrogation, the police showed Steven Latrice phone records and the autopsy report. Steven then confessed to the police that he had a romantic relationship with Latrice and they were engaging in sex. He added that on the night Latrice was murdered, she came home to his place and they had sex. However, at around 10 p.m., Latrice left his house and started driving home. After Latrice had left, he also left his house and went to spend time at the house of his other girlfriend, a lady known as Velma Newton, where he stayed until 1 a.m. He then returned home and entered his personal code for the alarm code log at 1:30 a.m. But Pastor Robert was not at home. His vehicle was also not in the driveway. So the police went to check the alarm log and found out that Steven was telling the truth. They also discovered that the master code, which belonged to Pastor Robert, was entered at 2:30 a.m. Deactivate the alarm system. After interrogating Steven, the officers went to interrogate Pastor Robert. During the interrogation, the police asked him where he was during the time Latrice was murdered. Pastor Robert said that he was at a function in the church that night, and he had left home at around 8 p.m. He said that he saw Latrice's white car in the driveway when he left, but when he returned home at around 11 p.m., neither Latrice nor Steven were at the house. He added that he never left the house again that night. Police needed to confirm if he was telling the truth, so they invited his sister, Willie Mae Thorpe, for an interview. Willie said she attended the same church that her brother, Robert, was preaching at, but on the night of Latrice's murder, she didn't see her brother, Pastor Robert, at the church. As the police continued interrogating Pastor Robert, they told him to roll up the sleeves of his shirt. And when he did so, the detectives noticed that he had fresh cut on his arm. They also noticed that he had scratches on his legs. The officers asked him about how he got the injuries. Pastor Robert explained to them that he got the injuries when he was helping Steven move a table. So the officers decided to confirm if he was telling the truth. They returned back to Steven for confirmation. Steven told the police that he had helped Robert move the table a few days prior, and Robert never got any cuts, scratches, abrasions, bruises, or anything while moving the table. During the interrogation, Steven submitted his DNA, fingerprints, and photograph. When the police ran his DNA against the DNA samples collected at Latrice's vehicle, there was no match, so Steven Randolph was ruled out as a suspect. The detectives also interviewed Pastor Robert's sister, Willie Mae, for confirmation about her brother's injuries. Willie told the police that she was there when Pastor Robert helped Steven move the table, but she didn't remember Pastor Robert sustaining any injury. So the police learned that Pastor Robert had lied to them. As the police continued interrogating Pastor Robert told the police that Steven often brought girls to the house. He added that on the night Latrice was murdered, he saw a white car parked outside their house after he came from church. He knew that the car belonged to Latrase Curtis because he had seen her once before. Pastor Robert told the police that he didn't know when Latrice had left the house. However, he saw Steven leaving the house that night, so the police located Steven's other girlfriend, Velma Newton. They informed her about Latrice's murder, and they asked her about Steven's whereabouts on the night of the murder. Velma confirmed that on that night, she was with Steven until 1 a.m. However, she was so shocked to know that Steven was cheating on her with Latrice Curtis. Velma also revealed to the police that her boyfriend, Steven, had been receiving threatening phone calls from a man with a blocked number. She revealed that the caller always had one message for Steven, and that was that Steven needed to stop doing what he was doing, or he would break his legs and end his dreams of joining the NBA. Velma added that she and Steven had their tires slashed after being taunted on the phone by the man. After the police heard the story of Velma, they figured out that the unknown caller might be Latrice's husband, Darin. They figured out that he might have discovered that his wife was cheating on him with Steven, so he might be the one sending Steven and Velma those threatening messages so that his wife, Latrice, could stop having an affair with him. The police obtained search warrants for Darin's house and vehicle. However, when they did their search, they didn't find anything that could incriminate him. The police officers also obtained a search warrant for Steven's house. When they got there, they found a minivan parked in the driveway of the house. They ran the number plate of the vehicle, and the results showed that the minivan belonged to Pastor Robert Reaves. Then the state highway patrolman, a man named Isaac Cooper, called the police and provided them with a tip about the whereabouts of the minivan on the night Latrice was murdered. Isaac said that he was patrolling Interstate 540 at that night as he drove by at around 1:30. Me saw two cars pulled over on the side of the highway. One was a white Nissan Sentra, and the other was a white Chrysler Pacifica van. Its hazard light was on, and wipers were going on. So he stopped to see what was going on. When he walked over to the van, he found it was completely empty. It had its key in the ignition, and the windows were rolled down partly, which was weird because it was raining. So he wrote down license plate of the van when he was about to go and check the Nissan Sentra, which was a few kilometers away from the van. He received an urgent call that took him away from the crime scene, so he didn't ran the license plate of the Nissan Sentra or check on it. However, when Latrace's death made the news, he recognized her car as being that exact same Sentra that he had seen the night before. As the police continued searching Pastor Robert's house, they recovered a half-melted trash can that contained fabric and accelerant. The trash can and its contents proved that Robert had recently tried to burn some sort of clothing. They also found one of his outfits stained with blood, and it was in the trash can. The police officers went back to question Pastor Robert about his van being at the crime scene. He told the officers that he doesn't have any idea how his van got there. He added that Steven had access to his van keys at any time, and he was allowed to use it without permission. He said that Steven had been using his van for a while after his car tires were slashed. Robert also told the police that Steven had been stockpiling knives and swords in the room. He added that one day, when he was in Steven's bedroom, he found a gun under his pillow. When the police questioned Steven about using the van, he said that he was using it when his car tires were slashed, but after fixing his car, he had not used the van for several weeks. As the investigations continued, the police found out that Robert had 3 phones: a house phone, a cell phone, and a secret phone line. They discovered that the secret phone line matched the strange phone calls that Steven said he and his girlfriend had been receiving from the unknown caller. The police also discovered that the second line phone data location matched the location of where Steven and his girlfriend, Velma Newton's car's tires were slashed. However, all of the calls were intentionally blocked so that Pastor Robert's number wouldn't be revealed. The police took Pastor Robert's DNA, fingerprints, and photographs. When they ran his DNA against the DNA found on the steering wheel of Latrase Curtis' vehicle, there was a match. So on April 2nd, 2008, the police arrested Pastor Robert Reaves and charged him with first-degree murder of Latrace Curtis. As Pastor Robert went on trial on September 2009 for the murder of Latrase Curtis, the prosecution narrated how Pastor Robert was obsessed with having sex with Steven Randolph. The obsession escalated into a violent rage mixed with jealousy, and so he murdered Latrice Curtis, who was getting on his way. The defense, on their part, argued that Robert had a disability. His left arm was half paralyzed because he had been mugged in New York and stabbed in this arm. They stated that Robert couldn't carry anything heavy with his left hand and didn't have a good grip with that hand, and the use of his left hand was very minimal. Therefore, it wouldn't have been possible for him to stab Latrice so many times with one hand. On October 7th, 2009, the jury retired to deliberate Robert Reaves' fate. 2 days later, that is on October 9th, 2009, the 44-year-old Robert Reaves was found guilty of the first-degree murder of the 21-year-old Latrase Curtis and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Robert Reaves is serving his life sentence at the Pasquotank Correctional Institution in Elizabeth City, North Carolina.